The world is constantly asking for a reaction. Someone says something cruel, a post provokes, a face frowns, and instantly the inner machinery starts spinning. Thought surges like a wave of electricity. The ego wakes up, hungry to defend, to justify, to correct, to strike back. It wants to exist through friction, because resistance is its food. Every time a reaction rises within, something inside whispers, "I am here again." That whisper is the ego, fragile, loud and desperate for survival. The paradox is simple yet invisible. To most, the more one reacts, the more one confirms the illusion of self. Every opinion you try to protect, every argument you feel compelled to win, every insult you can't ignore, these are not expressions of strength, but of identification. You react because the mind has mistaken a transient sensation for the whole of who you are. A thought, a belief, an emotion becomes me. And now, anything that challenges it feels like death. Alan Watts once said that the ego is nothing but a pattern of tension, a knot in consciousness pretending to be a person. It thrives on conflict because it cannot sustain itself in stillness. Silence exposes its absence. So it must provoke, it must judge, it must divide the world into for and against. In this endless performance, every reaction becomes a rehearsal of the same illusion, the false sense that there is a you behind the mask. Observe the mind closely in those moments of heat, when anger rushes through the body, when pride flares, when anxiety demands control. Notice how quick it is to create a narrative. He disrespected me. She shouldn't treat me like that. They don't understand. The story unfolds in seconds, and suddenly the entire being is possessed by it. Yet if you pause, even for a heartbeat, and look inward, something strange happens. The narrative begins to dissolve. The emotion remains, but it loses its teeth. The body might still tremble, but awareness steps in and sees it for what it is, just energy passing through. No enemy, no wound, no me being attacked, just movement within consciousness. That pause is the beginning of freedom. It's not suppression, it's not emotional coldness, it's awakening. Because when you stop reacting, you stop feeding the phantom that calls itself I. Every reaction you refuse to entertain weakens the ego's grip. The silence that follows is not emptiness, but space, vast, alive, aware. It's the same space in which thoughts appear and vanish, where worlds rise and fall. It is the background that never moves, never breaks, never needs defense. That background is what Alan Watts called the true self. Not the noisy surface of the mind, but the stillness beneath it. But the world is addicted to noise. It teaches that silence is weakness, that detachment is indifference, that peace means passivity. People mistake reaction for passion and restraint for absence. They think that to be alive is to constantly respond, to constantly prove, to constantly resist. And so they become mirrors, endlessly reflecting the chaos around them, never realizing they've lost their own reflection long ago. The ego loves this confusion because it keeps the wheel spinning. It keeps the illusion alive. To stop reacting is not to withdraw from life. It is to finally engage with it consciously. When you no longer react automatically, you begin to see the difference between action and reaction. Reaction is mechanical. It comes from fear, pride, or pain. Action arises from clarity. Reaction is noise. Action is music. Reaction repeats the past. Action flows from presence. Reaction feeds the ego. Action dissolves it. The still mind acts with precision because it no longer needs to defend a false identity. There's a peculiar freedom in not needing to have the last word, in watching someone insult you and realizing it touches nothing real, in observing the mind's attempt to rise, to justify, to fight, and simply smiling at it as one would smile at a child pretending to be a soldier. That smile is the collapse of the drama. It's the quiet laughter of someone who has seen the trick behind the show. You cannot be insulted when you see that there is no one to insult. You cannot be wounded when you know that the wound belongs to a shadow. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It's lucidity. It's the understanding that nothing external can truly diminish what you are, because what you are was never built on approval or resistance. The ego screams for validation because it was born from separation. It believes it must prove its worth, defend its borders, justify its existence. Awareness needs none of that. It simply is. It watches the rise and fall of every thought, every emotion, every storm, untouched. In modern life, this lesson is almost forgotten. Everything encourages reaction. The news, the algorithms, the conversations that revolve around outrage and opinion. Society rewards noise and punishes stillness. It tells you to take a stand, to defend your view, to never be silent. And so the ego thrives, disguised as conviction. But conviction without clarity is still bondage. You cannot see the truth when your mind is burning to be right. The forgotten lesson Alan Watts pointed to is that true freedom is inner non-resistance. The world may still move, people may still provoke, pain may still arise, but within there is no compulsion to fight it. You allow the wave to rise and fall without grabbing it. You let life pass through without trying to hold it. That's what it means to stop feeding the ego. You stop needing the world to confirm your existence. The ocean doesn't need to prove. It contains the waves. The self that reacts is the self that fears disappearance. But disappearance is precisely what reveals reality. When the I falls silent, when it no longer seeks to control the narrative, what remains is not nothingness. It is awareness itself, vast and unbroken. That awareness has no name, no history, no agenda. It cannot be praised or offended because it doesn't stand apart from what it observes. It is everything. To see that clearly is to awaken. The next time anger rises or someone challenges your sense of self, try this. Don't react, not as a strategy, but as an act of seeing. Watch the energy. Let it move through the body without identifying with it. The mind will scream for reaction, but something deeper will remain untouched. That untouched space is your truth. Every time you return to it, you dissolve a little more of the illusion. The ego fears this silence because it cannot survive there. But what dies is not you, it is the mask. And in that death, something luminous emerges. A peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. A presence that doesn't need to prove itself. A love that isn't sentimental, but total, because it no longer divides the world into self and other. When reaction stops, life begins. And in that stillness, you realize what Watts meant all along. The game only continues as long as you keep playing. When the ego begins to die, the first sensation is not peace, it is fear. The silent panic emerges when the mind realizes that its throne is crumbling. The structures built to protect identity, pride, status, control, start to dissolve, and something within trembles. The ego's voice whispers that without it, there will be nothing left. And in a way, it is right. What dies is not the body or the soul, but the false center that claimed ownership of both. The illusion of control evaporates, and in its absence, the naked truth stands. There was never a controller at all. Most people retreat at this point. They interpret the discomfort as failure, as spiritual regression. But the truth is that awakening feels like loss before it feels like liberation. The silence that once seemed peaceful becomes overwhelming. The mind deprived of reaction feels useless. There are no more dramas to feed on, no more opinions to polish. The world continues, but the person who used to narrate it begins to fade. It's a death the world doesn't recognize, a funeral without ceremony, yet it's the most sacred passage one can experience. Alan Watts said that the self is like a whirlpool in the river. It seems separate, but it's just water in motion. The moment you stop clinging to the illusion of form, you realize you were never apart from the current. But the moment of recognition is terrifying for the ego. It wants to exist as the whirlpool, not as the river. It wants definition. It wants edges. The river has none. It moves endlessly, shapelessly, with no one steering. That is reality. Spontaneous, ungraspable, free. The ego cannot survive in that vastness, because vastness has no center. As reaction fades, so does the identity built upon it. You start to notice how much of your life was structured around defending something imaginary. The arguments, the ambitions, even the goals were ways to maintain the illusion of continuity. Without reaction, The story stops progressing. There's no new chapter for the ego to write. You sit in the quiet and realize that the author has disappeared. The book was writing itself all along. This space can feel unbearable at first. The mind craves movement. It wants to think, compare, judge. It wants to reassert itself through meaning. But awareness doesn't need meaning to exist. It is meaning before words. So the seeker must endure this hollow stage, the silent desert between death and rebirth. There are no teachings to cling to, no authorities to confirm your progress. The teachers, the philosophies, even Alan Watts himself, eventually vanish into the same silence they pointed toward, because truth cannot be possessed. It can only be lived, and living, it requires the courage to dissolve completely. What emerges afterward is not a new identity, but the absence of one. The person you thought you were no longer dictates perception. Life continues, but it's effortless. You speak, but not from compulsion. You act, but not to prove. You love, but not to be loved back. The energy that once sustained the ego now flows freely through existence. You become a conduit, not a consumer. This is what the mystics meant by surrender. Not submission to an external power, but the collapse of the internal pretender. The irony is that what remains after the ego's death is what you've always been seeking. The peace, the clarity, the authenticity, they were never hidden. They were simply overshadowed by noise. When you stop reacting, the noise fades, and what's left is raw awareness, luminous and untouchable. The same awareness that watches the rise and fall of galaxies, that breathes through every creature, that remains unchanged beneath the storms of emotion. It's not personal, yet it feels more intimate than any self could ever be. This awareness doesn't resist suffering. It absorbs it. It doesn't avoid chaos. It moves through it because it understands that everything is itself in disguise. Pain and pleasure are not opposites, but different textures of the same field. The awakened being doesn't escape duality. He dances with it, knowing it was never real to begin with. There is no longer the anxiety of needing life to make sense. The game is still being played, but now it's seen for what it is, a play of energy, a cosmic dance with no audience. Silence becomes the natural state, not forced silence, not moral silence, but the silence of someone who has nothing left to defend. Words arise, laughter returns, tears still fall, but they are all expressions of the same vastness. The ego once reacted to protect an image. Now awareness responds only when necessary. Reaction has become creation. Every movement is deliberate, not as control, but as participation in the eternal rhythm. At this stage, the world might appear stranger. People still fighting for validation seem like dream characters acting out forgotten roles. The noise of the collective mind, the outrage, the envy, the endless proving becomes almost surreal. You can see the patterns clearly, the suffering behind them, the fear driving them. But instead of judgment, there's compassion. Not sentimental compassion, but the kind born from understanding. They can't help it. They are still caught in the spell of reaction. They still believe the whirlpool is real. The awakened mind doesn't try to change them. It knows that no amount of preaching can make someone see what they are not yet ready to lose. You cannot force someone to awaken, because awakening is the art of surrender, not of persuasion. And so the wise remain quiet. They live as mirrors, not as messiahs. Their presence speaks louder than their words ever could. That is why Alan Watts laughed so often, because he knew that all this seriousness, all this struggle to become something, was part of the cosmic joke. The ego tries to reach enlightenment, as if it were another possession, but enlightenment begins only when the one who seeks it disappears. In the absence of reaction, life regains its simplicity. The morning sun, the sound of footsteps, the taste of tea, everything becomes radiant. Not because it changes, but because the perceiver is no longer split in two. The mind that once labeled, compared, and grasped now rests. What's left is pure intimacy with existence. You are not watching life, you are life watching itself. There's no observer, only observing. No thinker, only thought. No lover, only love. And yet, this freedom is not an escape from the world, it's a return to it. The awakened one walks among people, works, eats, loves, and even argues sometimes, but nothing sticks. The reaction ends where awareness begins. The world's drama no longer burns the mind. It passes through like wind through open hands. This is what it means to stop feeding the ego. It's not about becoming indifferent. It's about becoming transparent. In that transparency, something miraculous unfolds. You discover that what you once called my consciousness is not yours at all. It's universal, timeless, boundless. The fear of death fades because what dies was never you. The fear of judgment fades because there's no one left to be judged. What remains is life itself, unguarded, spontaneous, sacred in its ordinariness. Every breath is a revelation, every silence a hymn. The ego sought meaning. Awareness is meaning. When you stop reacting, the world stops controlling you. When you stop feeding the ego, the illusion collapses. What's left is not emptiness but fullness, an overflowing presence beyond all names. That is the forgotten lesson. The self you defend was never real. The peace you chase was never far. The silence you feared was your own reflection. The end of reaction is not the end of life. It is the end of resistance to it. And in that end, everything finally begins. After awakening from reaction, life continues, but everything feels strangely lighter. The same people speak, the same problems appear, but the weight that once defined them is gone. What used to trigger anxiety or anger now feels distant, almost like watching an old movie in which you once played the lead. You still care, but differently. There is attention without attachment, compassion without chaos. It's as if life keeps testing your silence, whispering provocations just to see if you'll bite again. But the bait no longer tastes the same. The hunger that once drove you to prove, to justify, to fix, is gone. You simply watch, and in that watching, peace grows roots. It's easy to misunderstand this peace as detachment, but it's not coldness, it's clarity. You can listen to someone's pain without absorbing it. You can love without trying to own. You can be insulted and feel the emotion rise like a flame, yet not become the fire. The ego reacts because it mistakes feeling for identity. Awareness allows the feeling to exist, but doesn't confuse itself with it. The difference seems small, but it's the difference between drowning and floating. Both are in the same water, only one is free. In relationships, this understanding transforms everything. Arguments lose their addictive flavor. You stop trying to change people, not because you've given up, but because you finally see that control was never love. You no longer need to be right to feel real. You can walk away from chaos without resentment, because you understand that peace isn't found in the other. It begins where reaction ends. Alan Watts once said that trying to control someone's behavior is like grabbing water. The tighter you squeeze, the less you hold. When you release, you realize that connection only flows in openness. In solitude, this clarity deepens. The mind no longer rushes to fill silence with noise. The absence of distraction becomes sacred. You sit with yourself and realize there was never truly a self to sit with, only awareness watching the dance of thoughts, emotions, sensations. The loneliness that once felt heavy becomes transparent. You see that the ache for company was often a mask for the fear of seeing who you are without reflection. And when you finally stop running from that stillness, something extraordinary happens. The stillness becomes alive. It breathes, it listens, it loves. This is the essence of living without feeding the ego. Not an escape from the world, but a total participation in it without losing your center. You begin to see beauty in imperfection, humor in suffering, depth in simplicity. The ordinary becomes divine. Making tea, washing dishes, walking through a crowd. Everything reveals the same quiet rhythm beneath the surface. You realize that peace was never the absence of movement. It was the absence of resistance. Yet the world still demands reaction. People still misunderstand silence as weakness, still project their unrest onto those who found calm. There will be moments when you're tempted to return to the old ways, to argue, to justify, to defend. But each time, awareness reminds you nothing real can be threatened. Every reaction is a debt paid to illusion. When you refuse to engage, illusion starves, and eventually, it dies of neglect. Freedom begins to take a new shape, not as escape, but as mastery of attention. You discover that energy follows awareness. What you focus on grows. When you react, you pour your vitality into shadows. When you remain still, that same energy becomes light. You start to see why sages smile even in pain, because suffering without identification is purification. It burns what is false, leaving only the real. This doesn't mean you stop feeling. In fact, you feel more deeply, but the feelings no longer control you. Grief comes and goes like weather. Anger flashes, then dissolves. Joy rises quietly, without demand. There's no need to hold on to any of it. You realize that emotions are not enemies. They are movements of the ocean that you are. Reaction is drowning in a wave. Awareness is realizing you were never separate from the sea. In daily life, this awareness becomes practical wisdom. When someone yells, you see pain, not an enemy. When disappointment strikes, you see impermanence, not injustice. When desire arises, you see the mind's old attempt to find security in form. You still move through the world, working, loving, creating, but without the constant friction of self-concern. The game continues, but now you play without forgetting it's a game. Alan Watts often said that the true self plays hide-and-seek with itself through all beings. Reaction is part of that hiding, the game of pretending to be small, separate, offended. Awakening is not quitting the game, it's realizing that the one who was playing was always the same consciousness. The laughter of enlightenment is the laughter of someone who sees that even their suffering was part of the cosmic joke. You laugh, not because life is trivial, but because it's too vast to be taken personally. Even in chaos, there's an underlying intelligence, the same intelligence that grows trees, beats hearts, and guides galaxies. When you stop reacting, you align with that intelligence. You act without anxiety. You speak from stillness. You move like nature, precise, effortless, necessary. That is why awakened people seem calm even in crisis. Their trust is not in control, but in the flow itself. Of course, the ego tries to resurrect itself from time to time. It whispers, "You are enlightened now," hoping you'll believe in a new identity. But the awakened mind smiles at the trick. Enlightenment itself becomes another illusion to be released. There is no end point, no certificate of arrival. There is only the eternal play of awakening and forgetting, remembering and dissolving. Life breathes in and out through consciousness. Even the lapse into ego is part of the rhythm. In this realization, compassion matures. You stop dividing people into awakened and asleep, wise and foolish. Everyone is the same awareness, dreaming in different degrees of depth. The anger of one, the kindness of another, both are expressions of the same whole. You don't need to fix anyone. You simply embody presence, and presence teaches silently, sometimes through words, sometimes through laughter, sometimes through nothing at all. And so life becomes simple again. You eat when hungry, rest when tired, speak when necessary. You no longer chase meaning. Meaning arises in each moment. You don't seek peace. Peace is what remains when you stop seeking. You don't avoid pain. Pain is the teacher that keeps you awake. The ego lived on resistance. Awareness lives on surrender. The difference is infinite. To live like this is not to transcend humanity, but to finally embrace it. To feel everything without clinging to anything. To act without ownership. To love without fear. This is not a path towards something. It is the ending of the illusion that there was ever a path at all. The silence you once resisted becomes the foundation of everything. You walk through life knowing that nothing can be taken from you because nothing was ever yours to begin with. And in that realization, reaction dies forever. The game continues, the waves keep rising, but the sea within remains undisturbed. That is what it means to live awake, not detached, not superior, but simply present. The forgotten lesson is remembered, not through thought but through being. When you stop reacting, you stop feeding the ego. And in that stillness, life reveals its true nature, not as a battle to win, but as a mystery to love.